"There's no seat for you, Helen." My daughter-in-law said it with a little laugh, like she was joking, but nobody else at my grandson's birthday party laughed with her. I stood there in the middle of the backyard holding a blue gift bag with silver tissue paper while 20 people avoided looking directly at me. The late afternoon sun hung low over the Whitmore's fenced backyard, turning the string lights above the patio gold. Children ran through the grass with plastic swords and frosting on their cheeks, while country music drifted softly from an outdoor speaker near the grill. The whole place smelled like barbecue sauce, charcoal, and vanilla cake. It should have felt warm. Instead, I felt like I'd walked into someone else's family gathering by mistake. Brittany adjusted the paper plates on the long folding table and smiled tightly at me. "Oops," she added, waving one manicured hand toward the crowded seating area. "Looks like we ran out of chairs." Her tone was light, polite, the kind of voice people use when they want witnesses to believe they're being nice. I looked around slowly. Every child had a chair. Every parent had one too. Even Brittany's yoga instructor, a woman I'd never met before, sat comfortably beside the drink cooler sipping white wine from a plastic cup. My son Daniel sat near the center of the table beside Ethan, staring down at his phone as if something on the screen suddenly required his full attention. Not once did he stand up. Not once did he say, "Mom, take my seat." I tightened my grip on the gift bag until the tissue paper crinkled beneath my fingers. "I can stand," I said quietly. "Oh good," Brittany replied too quickly. "I knew you wouldn't mind." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. A child screamed happily near the bounce house. Then the music got louder again, and conversation slowly resumed around me, as if nothing unusual had happened. That was the cruel thing about moments like these. Nobody openly insults you. Nobody raises their voice. They simply continue eating while you disappear in plain sight. I moved toward the patio umbrella near the drink station and stood beside a folding table stacked with juice, boxes, and bags of chips. The metal legs of the table wobbled slightly every time someone brushed against it. From there, I could see the entire party clearly. Brittany floated between guests like the perfect hostess, laughing loudly and touching people lightly on the arm, while Daniel followed behind carrying trays and napkins like an assistant instead of a husband. Every few minutes she glanced toward me briefly, checking whether I was still standing there. I pretended not to notice. Ethan spotted me from across the yard while holding a paper plate with a slice of dinosaur cake. "Grandma," he shouted happily before running toward me. His little sneakers slapped against the wooden deck. "You came." I smiled immediately. Real smiles were becoming rare for me lately, but Ethan could still bring one out without trying. "Of course I came, sweetheart." He hugged my waist quickly before looking around. "Where are you sitting?" Before I could answer, Brittany's voice sliced cleanly through the air. "Ethan, honey, come open presents with your friends." Ethan frowned slightly. "But Grandma doesn't have a chair." Several nearby guests went quiet again. Brittany's smile stiffened for half a second before returning even brighter than before. "Grandma said she's fine standing." Ethan looked up at me uncertainly. His blue eyes were exactly like Daniel's had been at that age. Back when my son used to wait by the window every Friday night for me to come home from work carrying takeout pizza and rented movies. Back when I was still important in his life. "I'm all right," I told Ethan gently. "Today is your special day." He hesitated, then nodded slowly before running back toward the gift table where the other children were gathering. I watched him disappear into the crowd while the music continued playing overhead and paper plates rattled in the breeze. Then, quietly, almost carefully, I noticed something that made the hollow feeling in my chest deepen. Along the center of the table sat framed family photos from previous birthdays, vacations, and holidays. Daniel and Brittany at the lake. Ethan on Christmas morning. Brittany's parents smiling on a cruise ship. There were dozens of pictures, but not a single one included me. I stayed near the drink table for almost an hour pretending I was comfortable. Every few minutes, someone walked past me to grab another soda or refill their paper plate, offering quick smiles that never quite reached their eyes. I noticed people became strangely polite whenever humiliation happened in public. They acted softer, quieter, as if lowering their voices somehow erased what was happening right in front of them. Brittany moved through the party effortlessly in a pale pink blouse and white jeans that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. She had decorated every corner of the backyard with matching dinosaur banners and green balloons tied neatly along the fence. There was even a personalized sign near the cake table that read Ethan's roar-tastic 8th birthday in giant gold letters. She had thought about every detail. Every detail except where Daniel's mother was supposed to sit. I picked up a plastic cup and filled it with lemonade I did not really want, just so I would have something to hold besides my embarrassment. The ice cubes clinked softly against the sides while children laughed near the bounce house. A little girl accidentally bumped into my arm while running past and immediately turned back. "Sorry, ma'am," she said breathlessly before hurrying away again. "Ma'am, not Grandma, not Mrs. Whitmore, just another older woman standing near the edge of someone else's celebration." Daniel finally wandered over while Brittany gathered wrapping paper near the gift table. He shoved both hands into the pockets of his khaki shorts and avoided looking directly at me. "You okay, Mom?" he asked quietly. I almost laughed at the question, not because it was funny, but because of how carefully empty it sounded, like someone reading from instructions they barely understood. "I am fine," I replied. "It is a lovely party." He nodded quickly with visible relief. "Yeah, Brittany worked really hard on it." "Of course she did." Daniel glanced back toward the patio before lowering his voice slightly. "The seating thing was probably just an oversight." Oversight. Such a gentle word for something that felt deliberate. Enough to leave fingerprints. I took a sip of lemonade and looked out across the yard where Ethan was opening presents with sticky frosting still on his cheek. "Do you remember my 65th birthday dinner?" I asked softly. Daniel frowned faintly. "What about it?" "Brittany forgot to make me a plate that night, too." His expression tightened immediately. "Mom, come on. That was years ago." "I know." He shifted his weight awkwardly. "You always take things personally with her." There it was. The sentence that appears right before someone stops listening to you completely. I stared at my son quietly while the music played overhead and sunlight flickered through the oak tree branches above us. There had been a time when Daniel noticed everything about me. When he was 10 years old, he once walked nearly half a mile home in the rain because he spent his lunch money buying me cough drops after hearing me sneeze that morning. Now he could watch me stand through an entire family party without once offering his chair. "I should help Brittany," he muttered after a moment. "Of course," I said. He disappeared almost immediately, crossing the yard toward his wife with the obedient pace of someone constantly trying not to upset another person. I watched Brittany touch his arm lightly while speaking to him. Daniel nodded twice before helping carry another tray of cupcakes to the dessert table. Then, as if my chest had not already hollowed out enough for one afternoon, I noticed something else. Near the back fence sat a small memorial table covered with framed family photographs from birthdays, vacations, and holidays over the past several years. I walked toward it slowly. My stomach tightened with every step. There were pictures from Ethan's first day of school, Christmas mornings, beach trips in Florida, Thanksgiving dinners, Daniel and Brittany smiling beside everyone who mattered in their lives. But in every single photograph where I should have appeared, someone else stood in my place. I stood in front of the memorial table longer than I should have. Long enough for the lemonade ice to melt completely in my cup. Long enough for the laughter around me to begin sounding distant and hollow. At first I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe there simply were not many recent photographs of me. Maybe I had missed a few vacations because of my arthritis appointments or winter colds. Maybe families naturally drift apart over time, and nobody really notices until one day they are standing alone beside a folding table at a child's birthday party wondering when they stopped belonging. But the more I looked, the harder it became to lie to myself. In one Christmas photo, everyone wore matching red pajamas in front of Daniel's fireplace. I remembered that night clearly because Brittany told me at the last minute that Ethan had come down with a fever and they needed to cancel dinner. I spent Christmas Eve alone eating reheated soup and watching old game shows while snow fell outside my condo windows. Another photograph showed the family smiling on a rented boat somewhere in Florida. Brittany had told me that trip was canceled because of bad weather. Yet there they all were under bright sunlight wearing sunglasses and holding tropical drinks. Even Daniel looked relaxed in those pictures, happier than I had seen him in years. I slowly set my empty lemonade cup beside the tablecloth and stared at one photograph in particular. Ethan sat on Daniel's shoulders during what looked like a fall festival, while Brittany stood beside them holding caramel apples. In the corner of the picture, partially cut off near the edge, I noticed the sleeve of a pale blue cardigan. Mine. I remembered that day instantly. I had been there. Brittany took 3 group pictures before smiling apologetically and saying, "Helen, would you mind stepping aside for just one quick family photo?" I had stepped aside willingly because that was what mothers did. They adjusted. They accommodated. They made themselves smaller so everyone else could remain comfortable. Looking at the photograph now, I realized there had never been another picture after that one. The family photo had simply become the only photo. "Beautiful memories, huh?" A voice beside me said gently. I turned to see Marlene Cooper, one of the neighbors from Daniel Street. She held a paper plate with half a cupcake untouched near the edge. "They really know how to throw parties," she added politely. "Brittany certainly enjoys hosting," I replied carefully. Marlene glanced toward the crowded patio before lowering her voice slightly. "I hope you do not mind me saying this, Helen, but I always wondered why I stopped seeing you at family events." I forced a faint smile. Life gets busy. Her expression softened in a way that made my chest tighten unexpectedly. Pity was sometimes harder to endure than cruelty. "Well," she said quietly, "I noticed your absence." Before I could answer, a burst of laughter exploded near the grill where Brittany entertained several guests with another perfectly timed story. Everyone around her leaned closer while she spoke. Everyone except Ethan. My grandson sat alone at the gift table, pulling tissue paper apart with absent little fingers while the adults talked over him. He looked up suddenly and spotted me watching him. Then he smiled. A small, immediate smile. Honest. Uncomplicated. It hit me harder than anything else that afternoon because children still loved without strategy. Ethan waved me over eagerly. I started walking toward him slowly, but before I reached the table, I heard another child nearby ask a question that made my footsteps stop completely. "Why does your grandma always stand by herself?" There was a brief silence. Then another tiny voice answered matter-of-factly. "Mrs. Brittany says old people get in the way sometimes." The words settled over me more heavily than the humid summer air. Children rarely understand the weight of what they repeat. They simply carry truths adults leave lying around carelessly. I remained standing near the edge of the patio while the little boy who said it chased another child toward the bounce house, already forgetting the sentence completely. But I could not forget it. "Mrs. Brittany says old people get in the way sometimes." I stared across the yard at my daughter-in-law while she laughed beside the grill, one hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm. She looked beautiful in the golden evening light. Confident, comfortable, like someone fully certain the world belonged to her now. And perhaps that was the part that hurt the most. Brittany never treated me badly in ways people could easily point to. There were no screaming matches, no cruel insults in front of witnesses. Instead, she specialized in quieter things. Forgotten invitations, delayed phone calls, empty chairs, little disappearances that slowly taught everyone else how to treat me too. Looking back, I realized it had started years ago. Shortly after Daniel married her, Sunday dinners quietly stopped happening at my house. "It is just easier if we host now," Brittany had explained with a bright smile while unpacking expensive serving trays in her kitchen. Then holidays became shorter, then occasional, then somehow optional. Every change sounded reasonable on its own. That was how she did it. One grain of sand at a time, until eventually the entire shoreline changed shape beneath your feet. I remembered Ethan's kindergarten graduation 3 years earlier. Brittany told me the ceremony only allowed 2 guests because of limited seating. I stayed home and mailed Ethan a stuffed dinosaur instead. A week later, I saw photographs online showing 6 family members seated together in the school auditorium. Brittany's parents sat in the front row smiling proudly beside Daniel. I remembered the cold feeling that spread through my chest that afternoon too. Not anger, something quieter. The feeling of realizing your absence made other people more comfortable. "Grandma." Ethan's small voice pulled me back gently. He stood beside me holding a melted ice cream cup in both hands. Chocolate streaked one side of his shirt. "Can you help me open this?" I took the plastic spoon from him carefully and peeled back the stubborn foil lid while he watched patiently. Children still trusted older hands to solve small problems. "There you go," I said softly. Ethan grinned before taking one bite, then another. "Mom says too much sugar makes me crazy," he whispered confidentially. "Your mother might be right." He looked up at me thoughtfully. "Why are you sad today?" The question caught me off guard because he asked it so simply. Not accusing, not nervous, just observant. I glanced toward the crowded patio where Brittany passed out cupcakes while Daniel stacked paper plates beside her. Neither of them looked our way. I am just tired, I answered gently. Ethan studied my face for another second before nodding slowly, though I could tell he did not completely believe me. Then he pointed toward the folding chairs near the gift table. You can have mine if you want. My throat tightened unexpectedly. No, sweetheart. You keep your seat. But you have been standing forever. Forever. Children measured time differently. To an 8-year-old boy, one lonely hour probably did feel endless. Before I could respond, Brittany's voice carried sharply across the yard. Ethan, presents now, please. Ethan sighed dramatically before running back toward the table, still clutching his ice cream cup. I watched him go, and for the first time all afternoon, something inside me shifted slightly. Until then, I had been treating the missing chair like an accident I needed to politely survive. But standing there beneath the fading sunlight while laughter floated around me like background noise from another life, I finally understood what this really was. Brittany had not forgotten me. She had been carefully teaching everyone else to forget me too. The party began winding down shortly after sunset. The children grew slower from sugar and exhaustion, while parents gathered half-empty soda cans and folded paper napkins into neat little piles beside the coolers. The string lights overhead glowed brighter now against the darkening sky, casting soft golden shadows across the backyard. I remained near the patio railing watching guests slowly leave in pairs, carrying leftover cake slices wrapped in aluminum foil. Nobody asked if I needed help getting home. Nobody asked if I wanted to stay longer either. I had become something strangely weightless in that house. Present, but no longer included in the emotional math of the evening. Brittany stood near the gate thanking guests one by one with perfect hostess warmth. Thank you so much for coming. Drive safe. Text me those pictures later. She moved through goodbyes effortlessly, collecting compliments about the decorations and food like flowers handed to a pageant winner. Every now and then she glanced toward me briefly, almost cautiously now, as if trying to decide whether I fully understood what she had done. Daniel carried trash bags toward the garage without once meeting my eyes again. I was about to quietly gather my purse and leave when Marlene Cooper approached me near the driveway. Helen, she said gently, touching my arm lightly. Would you mind walking with me for a second? Her tone made me pause. We moved slowly toward the sidewalk while behind us the party lights flickered softly against the fence. Somewhere inside the house, Ethan laughed loudly at something on television. Marlene waited until we were several feet away before speaking again. I probably should not say anything, she admitted carefully, but after today, I do not think staying silent is the kind thing anymore. A cold feeling settled quietly into my stomach. What do you mean? She hesitated. A few weeks ago, Brittany came by my house asking questions. Questions about senior living communities. I stared at her without speaking. Marlene continued carefully, almost apologetically. She said she was trying to help you downsize because maintaining property alone becomes difficult at your age. At your age? Such polite little words people use before removing your independence piece by piece. I never discussed moving, I said quietly. I know. Marlene looked genuinely uncomfortable now. That is why I felt strange about it. She also asked whether my nephew was still working in real estate because Daniel might need advice listing your condo quickly. For a moment the sounds behind me seemed to disappear entirely. No laughter, no music, only the soft buzzing of cicadas in the warm evening air. My condo, I repeated faintly. Marlene nodded slowly. She made it sound like the decision was already happening. I gripped my purse tighter against my side. The leather suddenly felt too smooth beneath my fingers. Too expensive. My late husband Robert bought it for me during our 20th anniversary trip to Chicago. He used to say practical things should still feel beautiful if you planned on carrying them for years. The memory hit me so. Suddenly it nearly stole my breath. Robert would have noticed all of this immediately. He would have seen the missing chair before I even reached the table. He would have stood up beside me without hesitation. But Robert had been gone almost 6 years now, and grief had a way of teaching people around you how replaceable your presence had become. Helen, Marlene said softly, I hope I am wrong. I looked back toward Daniel's house. Through the kitchen window, I could see Brittany laughing while loading dishes into the sink. She looked completely at ease, like someone already arranging furniture inside a future she believed belonged entirely to her. And suddenly the missing chair from earlier no longer felt small. It was not carelessness. It was rehearsal. A quiet little demonstration showing everyone exactly where I belonged now. Off to the side. Temporary. Easy to remove. Thank you for telling me, I said finally. Marlene squeezed my hand once before heading toward her car. I stood alone on the sidewalk for another minute staring at the glowing house, where my family continued moving around without me. Then I reached into my purse for my car keys and realized something strange. For the first time all evening, I was no longer embarrassed. I was paying attention. I drove home slowly that night with the windows cracked open because the air inside the car felt too small for my thoughts. The streets were quiet except for the occasional glow of porch lights and television flickers behind curtains. Summer evenings used to comfort me. Robert and I spent years taking long drives after dinner with nowhere particular to go, just talking while old jazz stations played softly through the speakers. But as I pulled into the parking lot of my condo building, the silence felt different now. Sharper somehow, like something inside me had finally stopped pretending. My condo sat on the third floor of a quiet brick building about 15 minutes from Daniel's neighborhood. It was not luxurious, but it was mine. Every lamp, every framed photograph, every worn corner of furniture carried some piece of my life inside it. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the familiar scent of lavender hand soap and old books. For a moment, I simply stood there listening to the refrigerator hum softly in the kitchen. Nobody waiting inside. Nobody asking where I had been. The loneliness no longer frightened me the way it once had. What frightened me now was realizing other people viewed my solitude as an opportunity. I placed my purse carefully on the counter and walked toward the bookshelf beside the living room window. A framed photograph of Robert sat there smiling back at me from 20 years ago, his silver hair windblown from a fishing trip in Maine. He always smiled with his whole face, like happiness was something he trusted completely. You would hate this, I whispered quietly. My voice sounded strange in the empty room. I sank slowly into the armchair near the lamp and replayed the entire day piece by piece. The missing chair, the photographs without me, Daniel refusing to meet my eyes, the little boy repeating Brittany's words without understanding them, and finally Marlene's quiet confession on the sidewalk. Senior living communities. Selling my condo. Decisions already being discussed without me. I closed my eyes briefly and remembered another conversation from almost a year earlier. Brittany had come over unexpectedly one afternoon carrying coffee and lemon muffins from that expensive bakery she liked downtown. At the time, I thought she was making an effort to reconnect. We sat at my kitchen table while she complimented the condo repeatedly. It is cute, she said brightly. But do you ever worry about climbing stairs alone at your age? At your age again. Always wrapped in concern. I remembered laughing softly and telling her the exercise was probably good for me. Then she asked whether I had updated my will recently because family planning gets complicated later in life. I had not thought much about it afterward. Now the memory settled differently inside my chest. Not kindness. Inventory. I opened my eyes and looked around the condo carefully for the first time in months. My piano near the balcony door. The quilt Robert's mother stitched before she died. The bookshelf Daniel built for me when he was 17 years old and proud of. Finally learning how to use power tools correctly. These things were not clutter waiting to be downsized. They were proof I existed long before Brittany entered the family. The realization steadied me unexpectedly. I stood up and walked toward the hallway closet where I kept old file boxes stacked neatly on the top shelf. Robert used to organize every important document in labeled folders because he believed confusion created vulnerability. Insurance papers, property records, bank information, trust documents. I carried one heavy box back to the dining table and opened it slowly. Dust floated through the warm lamplight, while folders shifted beneath my fingers. Retirement accounts, tax returns, condo deed. Toward the bottom sat a sealed envelope with Robert's handwriting across the front. For Helen only. I stared at it for several seconds before carefully sliding one finger beneath the flap. Inside was a short handwritten letter dated 3 months before his death. Helen, if you are reading this, it means I was not there to protect you the way I promised. People change around money and property. Sometimes slowly enough that you do not notice until they stop seeing you as family and start seeing you as a problem to solve. My hands became very still. Beneath the letter rested the business card of Robert's attorney, Charles Barlow. I looked at the clock on the microwave. It was almost 11:30 at night. Too late to call anyone. But as I sat alone at the dining table holding Robert's letter beneath the soft kitchen light, I realized something important. Brittany had spent years quietly preparing for my disappearance. What she never considered was that I still had time to prepare too. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise without needing an alarm. For years after Robert died, grief had trained my body to wake early. The quiet hours before dawn were always the hardest because there was no noise to distract from absence. But this morning felt different. I was not lying awake missing someone. I was thinking. I made coffee slowly and stood by the kitchen window watching pale morning light spread across the parking lot below. A delivery truck backed into the grocery store across the street while sprinklers clicked rhythmically over the grass near the sidewalk. Ordinary sounds. Steady sounds. I found comfort in them. People like to pretend life changed all at once after betrayal, but the truth was quieter than that. The world kept moving normally while your understanding of it rearranged itself piece by piece. By 8:30, I was sitting inside Charles Barlow's office downtown. The building smelled faintly of old carpet and polished wood, exactly the way I remembered from years earlier when Robert handled estate paperwork there. Charles looked older now, thinner around the face, but his handshake remained firm. "Helen," he said warmly, "it has been too long." I smiled politely and handed him Robert's letter without speaking. He read it carefully while the office clock ticked softly behind him. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses slowly. "Robert was worried," he said quietly. "About what exactly?" Charles folded the letter carefully. "About what happens when widowed parents become financially convenient." The sentence landed heavily because it sounded so calm, so practiced, as if he had watched versions of this story unfold many times before. He opened a folder on his desk and reviewed several documents while I explained everything from the birthday party, the missing chair, the conversations about senior living, the condo questions. Charles listened without interrupting once. "Did you ever give Daniel or Brittany access to your accounts?" he asked. "No power of attorney?" "No, good." He nodded once, almost approvingly. "Then you still control the situation more than you think." More than you think. The words stayed with me long after I left his office, carrying a new folder tucked carefully beneath my arm. On the drive home, I stopped at the bank for the first time in months. The young woman at the desk smiled brightly while helping me open a separate trust account Robert established years earlier but never fully activated. I remembered him mentioning it once after dinner while reading financial paperwork at the kitchen table. "Protection matters more than prediction," he said casually at the time. Back then I assumed he was talking about markets. Now I realized he was talking about people. By afternoon, I sat once again inside my condo surrounded by papers spread neatly across the dining table. Property records, beneficiary forms, insurance updates. Every signature felt strangely grounding. Like rebuilding invisible walls around parts of myself I had carelessly left unguarded for too long. Around 3 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Thanks for coming yesterday. Ethan loved seeing you." I stared at the message for several seconds. Not once did he mention the missing chair. Not once did he ask whether I was hurt. Somewhere deep down, my son already knew exactly what had happened. He simply hoped silence would smooth it over the way silence always had before. My fingers hovered above the screen briefly before I typed back. "It was a lovely party." That was all. No accusation. No emotional speech. I was beginning to understand something important about people like Brittany. They relied on emotional reactions because reactions created confusion, defensiveness, guilt, family meetings full of tears and apologies that changed nothing. But paperwork was different. Boundaries were different. Quiet decisions made behind closed doors were different. That evening, I cooked myself a simple dinner of baked chicken and rice before carrying my plate to the balcony. The summer air felt cooler now, and somewhere nearby a radio played soft classic rock from an open apartment window. For the first time in a very long while, I did not feel like a lonely old woman waiting for her family to remember her value. I felt alert, careful, present inside my own life again. As the sun disappeared behind the buildings across the street, I opened the folder Charles prepared for me earlier that day. On top sat a newly updated draft of my estate documents. Near the bottom of the page, beneath several paragraphs of legal language, one sentence stood out clearly enough to stop me cold. "Upon Helen Whitmore's passing, the condominium property and trust assets shall transfer directly to Ethan Whitmore upon his 25th birthday, supervised independently by trustee appointment." Not Daniel. Not Brittany. Ethan. I stared at the sentence for a long time while evening shadows slowly filled the balcony around me. Then quietly, almost without realizing it, I smiled. 3 weeks passed quietly after Ethan's birthday party. Brittany never mentioned the missing chair again, and neither did Daniel. Life continued in the careful, polished way families often continue after something painful has happened, but nobody wants to name it aloud. Daniel called once a week like always. Short conversations. Weather updates. Questions about my blood pressure medication. Never anything real. Brittany occasionally sent group texts filled with smiling emojis and photographs of Ethan's soccer practice or school projects. Looking at them felt strange now, like receiving postcards from people slowly preparing to leave you behind. Meanwhile, I kept meeting with Charles Barlow downtown. Not dramatically, not secretly, just carefully. Every document Robert had prepared years ago was reviewed and strengthened. The condo, my retirement accounts, the small investment portfolio Daniel barely knew existed. I even established a private education trust for Ethan that neither parent could access directly. Charles explained every detail patiently while I signed papers beneath the warm office lights. Most people wait too long to protect themselves, he told me one afternoon. They assume family loyalty works like legal protection. It does not. I thought about that sentence often afterward. One rainy Thursday evening, Daniel called unexpectedly while I was folding laundry. "Mom," he said casually, "Brittany and I were thinking maybe you should come for Thanksgiving this year." I paused with one of Robert's old sweaters still draped across my lap. Last year, I spent Thanksgiving alone after Brittany claimed Ethan had the flu and they needed to cancel dinner plans at the last minute. 2 days later, I saw photographs online showing 20 people gathered around their dining table, smiling beside a perfectly roasted turkey. "That sounds nice," I replied evenly. "Brittany wants to make things feel more connected again," Daniel added quickly. Connected again. Such careful wording. Like distance had simply appeared naturally instead of being constructed deliberately, one missing invitation at a time. Thanksgiving arrived cold and gray with thin rain tapping softly against my windshield during the drive to Daniel's house. I wore a dark green sweater Robert always liked and carried a homemade pecan pie balanced carefully on the passenger seat beside me. The neighborhood smelled faintly of fireplaces and wet leaves. Through the windows of nearby houses, I could see families gathered around warm dining tables glowing gold against the early evening darkness. Daniel opened the front door before I knocked. "Hey, Mom." He hugged me awkwardly with one arm while stepping aside to let me enter. Inside, the house looked beautiful. Candles flickered along the dining room shelves. Soft jazz music played quietly from hidden speakers. Brittany had set the long table with cream-colored linen napkins folded into delicate shapes beside polished silverware. Every seat already had a handwritten name card resting neatly against the plates. I noticed mine immediately. Helen, positioned at the far end of the table beside the hallway entrance, slightly separated from everyone else. Not hidden exactly, just carefully placed at the edge again. Brittany appeared from the kitchen carrying a casserole dish and smiled brightly when she saw me. "Helen, I am so glad you made it." She kissed the air beside my cheek without actually touching me. "The pie smells amazing." I handed it over calmly. "Thank you for inviting me." "Of course," she replied smoothly. "Family is important. Family is important." I almost admired how easily the words came to her. Dinner began an hour later after Brittany finished arranging dishes with near military precision. Turkey, sweet potatoes, green beans with almonds, homemade cranberry sauce in crystal bowls. Ethan sat across from me, wearing a tiny navy button-down shirt and swinging his legs beneath the chair while explaining dinosaur facts to anyone willing to listen. Several times during dinner, I caught Brittany watching me discreetly between conversations, waiting perhaps, measuring whether I still understood my assigned place at the edge of things. Halfway through dessert, Daniel cleared his throat nervously. "Mom," he began carefully, "Brittany and I actually wanted to talk to you about something." There it was, the real reason for the invitation. Brittany folded her napkin delicately before smiling with practiced concern. "We have just been worrying about you lately," she said softly. "Living alone can become difficult as people get older." The room became very quiet. Even Ethan stopped moving his spoon. I set my coffee cup down gently onto the saucer. "I see." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "We found this really nice senior community about 20 minutes away. They have activities, medical staff, transportation. It might honestly be safer for you. Safer. There was that word again. Always dressed as kindness. Brittany slid a glossy brochure across the table toward me. On the cover, silver-haired couples smiled beside a swimming pool beneath bright blue skies. I looked at it calmly for several seconds before reaching into my purse. Then, without raising my voice once, I placed my own folder gently onto the table between the turkey platter and the candle centerpiece. Charles Barlow's business card rested clearly on top. The entire table went still after I placed the folder down beside the candles. Even the soft jazz music in the background suddenly seemed too loud for the silence sitting between us. Brittany's smile did not disappear immediately. That was the impressive thing about her. She had spent years mastering expressions before mastering sincerity. "What is this?" she asked lightly, though her voice sounded thinner now. I folded my hands neatly in my lap before answering. "Updated estate documents." Daniel frowned immediately. "Mom, nobody is talking about your estate." I looked at him calmly. "You brought me brochures for assisted living during Thanksgiving dinner." His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Across the table, Ethan looked back and forth between us with growing confusion while absent-mindedly stirring whipped cream into his pie. Brittany recovered first. She leaned forward with careful concern painted across her face. "Helen, you are misunderstanding us. We are only worried about your future." "I know," I said softly. "That is why I decided to protect it myself." I slid the folder gently toward Daniel. He hesitated before opening it. Several pages shifted beneath the dining room light, while his eyes moved quickly across legal paragraphs and highlighted sections. The color slowly drained from his face. Brittany reached for the papers immediately. "What is this trust?" she asked sharply before catching herself and softening her tone again. "I mean, what exactly does this mean?" "It means," I replied quietly, "that my condo, savings, and investments are protected under independent management now." Daniel stared at me across the table. "Protected from who?" I held his gaze for several long seconds. "Anyone who mistakes my age for permission." Nobody spoke after that. Outside, cold rain tapped gently against the dining room windows while candlelight flickered softly across the untouched dessert plates. Brittany flipped through the documents faster now, her polished composure beginning to crack around the edges. "Ethan inherits everything?" she asked suddenly. There it was. Not concern for me. Not surprise. The real question finally surfacing. Eventually, I answered. "Under supervision when he is older." "But Daniel is your son," she said carefully. "Robert and I already gave Daniel everything we were meant to give him. An education, support, a stable home, love." My voice remained calm. "The rest belongs to me while I am still alive." Daniel lowered the papers slowly onto the table. He looked exhausted suddenly. "Older than 40. Mom," he said quietly, "why are you doing this?" I almost answered immediately. Then I looked around the dining room instead. The polished silverware, the perfect centerpiece, the carefully arranged chairs around the table. Every seat occupied this time. Every seat except the one they had tried to prepare for me somewhere else. "Because," I said finally, "I realized something at Ethan's birthday party." Brittany went completely still. "A person does not accidentally disappear from family photographs, Daniel. They disappear one small decision at a time." Nobody moved. Ethan stared down at his pie now, sensing enough tension to stay silent even without understanding it fully. Daniel rubbed one hand slowly across his face. "We never wanted you to feel unwanted." "You did not need to say it out loud," I replied gently. "People reveal things by what space they stop making for you." Brittany looked away first, toward the kitchen, toward the rain outside, anywhere except directly at me. For the first time since she entered our family, she no longer looked fully certain of herself. And strangely, I did not feel victorious watching it happen, only clear-headed, like someone finally seeing a room properly after years of dim lighting. Dinner ended quietly after that. No dramatic argument. No shouting. Daniel helped clear the table while Brittany washed dishes in stiff silence beside the sink. I gathered my coat near the front door while Ethan ran upstairs to grab something from his room. A minute later, he came hurrying back down the staircase, clutching a folded piece of construction paper decorated with crayons and stickers. "Wait," he said breathlessly. "I made this at school." He handed it to me proudly. On the front, drawn in crooked blue marker beside a long dinner table, was a tiny stick figure with silver hair sitting in the biggest chair. Above it, Ethan had written carefully in uneven capital letters, "Grandma's seat." My throat tightened so suddenly I had to look down for a second before speaking. "It is beautiful," I whispered. Ethan smiled brightly. "I saved your chair this time." Behind him, Daniel stood frozen near the dining room doorway while Brittany remained motionless beside the kitchen sink. I slipped the drawing carefully into my purse beside Robert's old letter and bent down to kiss Ethan's forehead. Then I walked out into the cold November night, feeling something I had not felt in years. Not anger, not revenge, just the quiet certainty that I no longer needed anyone's permission to belong somewhere.